It's time for another countdown. Throughout the process of making movies, there's always going to be ideas that are left on the cutting room floor. Things that may not have been economically possible at the time, or ideas that were best left forgotten due to their ridiculousness. But of course, there's also those ideas that are just so interesting, so intriguing that you can't help but want to see them in action. In today's countdown episode, we're going to take a dumpster dive through the discarded waste bin of the kaiju genre. This is my top 10 most wanted unmade kaiju films. Number 10. Batman vs. Godzilla. I mean, it's kinda gotta be on the list, right? Two of the most iconic characters in pop culture history in a movie together. Who wouldn't want to see the Caped Crusader face off against the King of the Monsters? Batman vs. Godzilla was originally going to be produced as a collaboration between Toho Studios in Japan and Greenway Productions in America. There are two treatments of the story, one by Toho regular Shinichi Sikazawa, and another by an unknown American author. The latter can actually be found online if you look hard enough. The story features a lot of instances of Batman and Robin interacting with Japanese cultures such as kabuki theater and samurai sword fights. Godzilla is controlled by a villain who also has a weather control device in his clutches as well. Batman, Robin, and Batgirl all fight Godzilla with the Batmobile, Batcopter, and Batcycle, and it would have been a climactic showdown for the ages. Although it would have been a great sight to see, Toho and Greenway never officially collaborated far enough to get a script written, and the plans were dropped in favor of a more traditional Godzilla film. Number 9. Mothra vs. Bagon. Bagon is a character I'm sure many Godzilla fans are familiar with, but who has remained completely absent from the film portion of the franchise, appearing only in the Super Godzilla video game. But Bagon has probably the most unfortunate history of all unmade Godzilla monsters, having been considered for nearly every single Godzilla project throughout the 1990s, and every single one has ended up on the cutting room floor. Out of all the treatments featuring Bagon, this is the one that intrigues me the most. For starters, it's a non-Godzilla focused kaiju film from Toho, which are a rarity, if not completely extinct these days. It also features a wide variety of locations not normally seen in kaiju films, such as Malaysia. While the majority of the story is mostly the same as the first Rebirth of Mothra film, the general concept and locations selected still interest me enough to place this movie at my number 9 spot. Number 8. Godzilla vs. M. From the mind of GMK director Shusuke Kaneko comes this interesting idea about Godzilla battling a mutated astronaut monster. The plot revolves mostly around the astronaut's attempts to come to terms with his newfound monsterdom through the help of his human daughter. The interesting moral dilemmas it produces definitely pique my curiosity. This idea sounds unique for a Godzilla film. It's not often you see him facing a humanoid monster. It takes some inspiration from the Ultraman episode My Home is Earth, featuring another mutated astronaut monster, and it would be interesting to see that dynamic played out with a larger runtime and bigger budget. Although the idea was sound, it was scrapped by director Kaneko because it felt a little too depressing to him. A shame, but he did end up making one of the best Godzilla films, so it's not a total loss in my opinion. Number 7. Gamera vs. Garasharp. The first and only non-Toho entry on the list, Gamera vs. Garasharp was a proposed film by Daiei Studios around 1972. The story was fairly standard for a Gamera film and featured the serpentine monster Garasharp and the mushroom monster Maruko Bukarapa. After Gamera defeats Garasharp, it's revealed that the monster had 2 infants it was caring for, prompting Gamera to fly them to an unmarked island where they can live in peace. Gamera vs. Garasharp makes this list purely for the enemy monster. Garasharp's design is super unique, and I would have loved to see another Soup Nation snake kaiju on the big screen. Unfortunately, Daiei Studios went bankrupt before the film got the chance to be made, but a short film version exists as a DVD extra featuring puppet versions of the kaiju. It may not be the full film, but it's just enough to make me hope that the concept is revived in the future. Number 6. Godzilla Ex Varon, Baragon, and Anguirus. Yet another project proposed by Shusuke Kaneko. This is the original concept for what Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah giant monsters all-out attack eventually evolved from. The story beats are basically the exact same, only instead of Mothra and King Ghidorah, Varon and Anguirus are the main monsters who face Godzilla. And yes, Baragon is still there, even in the new film, being the only kaiju from the original treatment to make it to the final film. Along with the new monsters, the Gotengo from 1963's Atragon also made an appearance, alongside Godzilla series staples, the Maser Cannons. Those two were dropped from the film to keep it more grounded. Though the entire concept was not entirely canned, Varon and Anguirus' roles were removed because Toho felt the monsters weren't popular enough to warrant the high billing. They had just released 2 Godzilla films with brand new monsters that were disappointments at the box office and wanted something to attract audiences again. Though GMK is still a phenomenal film on its own, one can't help but wonder if it would have been improved had the original concept stayed intact. Number 5. Godzilla vs. Godzilla. Out of all the concepts featured here, this one might be the most out there. A ghost version of Godzilla manifests in Tokyo and eventually possesses Godzilla Jr. Godzilla must fight to regain his adopted son and defeat the spectral menace that haunts Japan. Sounds more like an Exorcist parody than a Godzilla film treatment. This was one of the original concepts that were tossed around before the making of Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, and it introduces one of my favorite potential ideas for the Godzilla franchise, Godzilla facing another member of his species. In the Godzilla series, we have seen Godzilla interact with younger members of his species, as well as facing genetic hybrid mutations and mechanical versions of himself, but never an actual second Godzilla. How would this play out? Who would be the villain? Sadly, Godzilla vs. Godzilla was eventually scrapped and, as mentioned earlier, evolved into Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Maybe someday Toho will have Godzilla fight another Godzilla, but right now, all we have is an unused script to fulfill that fantasy. Number 4. Godzilla vs. the Asuka Fortress. Godzilla vs. the Asuka Fortress is a story that isn't as extravagant as Godzilla vs. Godzilla, nor is it fanservice-y like Godzilla Ex Varon, Baragon, and Anguirus. Why Godzilla vs. the Asuka Fortress is ranked so high on this list is because of its originality. The film deals with a revolt inside the Japanese government and the deployment of a giant super mecha to face Godzilla. Not much is known beyond that, but it intrigues me enough to place it so high. One of my favorite aspects of a good Godzilla film is when the human story is just as entertaining as the monster story. Godzilla vs. the Asuka Fortress definitely sounds like a film that would fit that bill. We don't have any clue what the Asuka Fortress actually is, but I hypothesize it might be the stronghold of the revolt and where the giant mecha is supposedly housed and unleashed from. Overall, a clever and unique logline that, like the other films on this list, hopefully can be revisited one day. Number 3. Godzilla vs. Gamera. Because of course, who wouldn't want to see the King of the Monsters face off with the Guardian of the Universe? Now, interesting trivia, Godzilla and Gamera did actually meet and face each other before, in a Japanese stage show in the 1970s. No real information exists about this event beyond some flyers, but it's interesting to note that the concept existed that far back in history. This concept, however, came about in 2002 as Katakawa Pictures approached Toho Studios with the idea of making a Godzilla vs. Gamera movie. Unfortunately, Toho declined the offer and that was that. It's a real shame that it didn't get made, but it does provide an interesting moral query. Who would win? The likely candidate would be Gamera, as Godzilla could far more easily be delegated to the villain role, but it could also be Godzilla winning the fight, but losing to a third party. Either way, this is definitely one of the most hotly contested bouts in film fandom, on par with Freddy vs. Jason, Alien vs. Predator, and of course, King Kong vs. Godzilla. While it's likely to never see the light of day, one can't help but wonder, what would happen if Toho said yes? Number 2. Godzilla Reborn. Godzilla Reborn was a relatively unknown, unmade film that didn't gain much traction until the early 2010s. It was an American-made sequel to Godzilla 2000 that would have featured Hollywood actors like Bruce Campbell, Leonard Nimoy, Dick Miller, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Christopher Lee. Talk about an all-star cast. The general story revolved around Godzilla rampaging in the Hawaiian Islands before encountering a lava bat creature named Amoeba. The film was proposed by Michael Schlesinger, one of the producers who worked on the American cut of Godzilla 2000. He proposed the concept to Sony Pictures and even got director Joe Dante on board to helm the project. The film would have utilized practical man-in-suit effects and even would have had the Toho special effects staff on board to help out. A script was written with the human scenes done in a more tongue-in-cheek style to contrast with the more serious monster sequences. The project received a lot of support at Sony, but unfortunately fell through when a studio had declined to budget the production. It really is a shame because this idea sounds like it could have been a ton of fun, especially with such a great cast lined up for it. The idea of a joint production between Toho and an American studio is also intriguing, and one that hasn't necessarily been seen before or since. Unfortunately, it's once again a victim of the cutting room floor. Number 1. Jan de Bont's Godzilla. The Ultimate and Lost Kaiju films. This is the original proposed concept for the first American Godzilla film. The actual story behind this production deserves a video itself, but here's a brief summary. Director Jan de Bont was brought on by Sony to direct the Godzilla adaptation in 1992, with the film scheduled for a 1994 release. Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott wrote a screenplay that saw Godzilla face a giant metamorphosing monster called the Griffin. Maquettes were developed featuring both monsters with designs by Ricardo Delgado, sculpted by Stan Winston, famous for his work on Jurassic Park and the Terminator films. Unfortunately, de Bont came to blows with the studio over the proposed budget. Sony wouldn't allow the film's estimated $140 to $180 million budget to pass, even with de Bont's insistence it could be done for $100 million. De Bont left the project, Rossio and Elliott's script was scrapped alongside the Godzilla and Griffin designs, and the project entered development hell. However, as we know today, it did end up being made by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin into one of the most vilified and hated reboots of all time. Of special note is the fact that Godzilla 1998 eventually had a budget of about $130 to $150 million, which was well beyond the original proposals from de Bont, Rossio, and Elliott. Elliott even wrote an essay where he blamed the film's financial failure on the change in script and director, stating that the original product would have been much more profitable. profitable. And to be honest, it's kind of hard to say he's wrong. Godzilla in 1998, despite its resurgence in popularity among younger fans, was an abject failure that completely ruined the image and reputation of Godzilla in the West. For over 15 years, it was the sole image of Godzilla in most of the general audience's mind, and it wouldn't be redeemed until 2014 when Hollywood finally made a Godzilla that, at the very least, represented what fans loved about the character. One can't help but wonder, if Bont's Godzilla was made, what would the Godzilla franchise look like today? This line of thinking, this what-if possibility, this is why the 1994 American Godzilla reboot is my #1 most wanted unmade kaiju film. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Countdown. There's plenty more lists to come in the future. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.